HOA tried to control my yard, so I turned it into a jungle. Chapter 1, the HOA's first warning. It all started with a letter. A neatly folded envelope slipped under the front door, bearing the familiar logo of the Homeowners Association. At first glance, it seemed routine, the kind of notice that occasionally circulated about neighborhood meetings or community events. But as the homeowner unfolded the paper, the tone was far from friendly. The HOA had issued a formal warning: the front lawn was not up to their community standards. The grass, they claimed, was too long, uneven, and in violation of the guidelines that demanded a clean, manicured aesthetic. The letter went further, outlining a fine schedule that would begin within 2 weeks if the problem was not corrected. The amount was steep, designed to intimidate rather than to simply encourage compliance. At first, the homeowner felt a wave of irritation. The lawn was not perfect, but it was healthy, green, and thriving in a natural way. It wasn't filled with weeds or dead patches, just allowed to grow a little longer than the razor-edge style most neighbors seemed to prefer. But the HOA saw it differently. They demanded uniformity, strict adherence to arbitrary rules, and the kind of lawn that looked more like a plastic carpet than a living, breathing ecosystem. Still, the letter was not something that could simply be ignored. The HOA made it clear: failure to comply would escalate fines, and continued non-compliance could even lead to legal action. The homeowner felt trapped, but also stubborn. Why should they be forced to cut and chemically treat their yard just to satisfy a board of self-appointed rule enforcers? A second letter arrived the following week. This time, the language was harsher, almost threatening. Attached were photographs taken from the street, zooming in on patches of wild clover and native grasses. The HOA declared these plants unsightly nuisances and gave a strict deadline for restoration. The homeowner's frustration grew. This wasn't just about lawn care anymore, this was about control. Rather than reaching for the lawnmower, the homeowner reached for something else: research. They began digging into local ordinances, environmental laws, and property rights. Hours turned into late nights spent scrolling through online forums, reading state conservation websites, and even contacting local wildlife organizations. Slowly, a plan began to take shape. The HOA might demand conformity, but the homeowner discovered a hidden shield: native plant protection laws. In their state, certain native plants and natural habitats were legally protected. Homeowners who cultivated native species or developed certified wildlife habitats were often exempt from HOA restrictions. The realization was like a spark. If the yard could be transformed from a simple patch of grass into a certified wildlife sanctuary, the HOA's threats would collapse under the weight of the law itself. The very yard they despised could become untouchable. The next morning, instead of mowing, the homeowner began sketching out ideas. Which plants thrived in the region? Which attracted pollinators? Which qualified as native and protected? Every detail was carefully mapped. What had begun as an annoyance was turning into something far more powerful: a strategy for survival and, ultimately, revenge. The HOA thought they had cornered their target. But in reality, they had awakened something they could never control. And as the homeowner made their first trip to the local nursery, buying armfuls of wildflowers, shrubs, and seedlings, the transformation was already underway. The yard was no longer just a lawn. It was becoming a statement. Chapter 2, Seeds of Defiance. The first few days of the transformation looked innocent enough. Neighbors walking their dogs or jogging past probably assumed the homeowner was simply doing some overdue landscaping. A few bags of soil, flats of seedlings, and a collection of pots did not seem out of the ordinary. But beneath the surface, the project was deliberate, calculated, and guided by a strategy far beyond simple beautification. The homeowner had discovered that the state recognized certified wildlife habitats as protected spaces. That meant that once the process was complete, the HOA would lose its leverage entirely. To get there, however, the homeowner needed to follow the steps: plant native species, provide food and shelter for wildlife, and ensure a sustainable source of water. It was a checklist that required patience, effort, and careful documentation. The first wave of plants went into the ground, milkweed for monarch butterflies, coneflowers to draw bees, and native grasses that grew tall and thick, providing shelter for small creatures. Instead of chemicals and fertilizers, compost enriched the soil. The yard that once resembled every other square of clipped green in the neighborhood now looked different, alive in a way that lawns rarely do. It didn't take long for the HOA to notice. By the end of the week, a third letter arrived, written with unmistakable irritation. They accused the homeowner of deliberately ignoring compliance orders and warned that daily fines would begin accruing. The letter threatened liens, legal action, and the possibility of forced lawn service at the homeowner's expense. But by this point, fear had shifted into determination. The homeowner photographed every planting, documented every species with receipts and guides, and even contacted the local conservation department to confirm the validity of their choices. Each new flower bed wasn't just for beauty, it was evidence in a growing case against the HOA. The changes were not just legal, they were visible. Birds that rarely appeared in the neighborhood began to perch on the new shrubs. Bees and butterflies floated through the air, drawn by the blossoms. Even a pair of rabbits appeared one morning, nibbling at the edges of the wild grasses. The yard had become something more than a patch of land. It was transforming into an ecosystem. Of course, the neighbors had mixed reactions. Some whispered in support, quietly expressing envy at the colors and life blooming in contrast to their sterile lawns. Others glared as they passed, clearly echoing the HOA's disapproval. And then there was Karen, the loudest voice on the HOA board, who made her disdain known with pointed stares and muttered remarks. She had always insisted on pristine lawns, trimmed hedges, and absolute conformity. To her, this growing jungle was nothing less than an act of rebellion. Karen escalated quickly. She began patrolling past the house with her phone in hand, snapping photos from different angles, sending them straight to the HOA. She confronted delivery drivers, asked landscapers questions, and even cornered a neighbor in her attempt to gather complaints. What she didn't realize was that every picture, every complaint, and every threat she documented was only strengthening the homeowner's eventual defense. By the end of the month, the yard had doubled in density. Vines trailed up trellises, wildflowers swayed in the breeze, and birdhouses dotted the property. The transformation was undeniable, and the HOA's fury was boiling over. But the homeowner had yet to play their most powerful card, certification. The paperwork was nearly complete. All that was needed was an inspection to confirm that the property qualified as a wildlife habitat. And once that certification arrived, the HOA's authority would vanish. The seeds of defiance had been planted, literally. But the fight was far from over. Because Karen was about to launch her boldest move yet. Chapter 3, Karen Strikes Back.
The HOA regulations.
Karen had always considered herself the guardian of the neighborhood standards. In her mind, she wasn't just enforcing rules, she was protecting property values, preserving order, and ensuring that every home projected perfection. To her, the homeowner's growing yard was a stain, a blemish that threatened the carefully crafted image of the community. And Karen was determined to erase it. She started small, filing formal complaints through the HOA's online portal. Each one was nearly identical, accusations of overgrown vegetation, unsightly weeds, and violations of community landscaping guidelines. But when the HOA board received her complaints, they didn't just file them away. They acted. Within days, another letter appeared at the homeowner's door, this time outlining not just fines but a mandatory deadline for restoration of the yard. The letter warned that if the homeowner failed to comply, the HOA had the authority to hire contractors to fix the problem and bill the homeowner directly. But Karen didn't stop there. She escalated her personal campaign, patrolling the sidewalk daily, snapping photos of every new plant and blade of grass. She called code enforcement, reporting supposed nuisance vegetation. She even attempted to rally other neighbors, warning them that if this jungle was allowed to stand, property values would plummet. For the homeowner, the harassment was relentless. Yet beneath the frustration, there was a growing sense of satisfaction. Every letter, every fine, every photograph became another piece of evidence. And the more Karen pushed, the stronger the eventual defense would become. Still, the pressure was real. The fines were piling up, even though they would eventually be disputed. The homeowner's mailbox filled with threats. Late at night, anxiety crept in. What if the HOA truly could force them to mow everything down? What if the certification didn't come through in time? But in the daylight, hope returned. The yard had blossomed into a living refuge. Monarch butterflies floated gracefully among the milkweed. Goldfinches darted between tall sunflowers. Bees hummed over purple coneflowers. The transformation was undeniable, and it was beautiful. Even a few neighbors who once frowned at the mess had stopped to quietly compliment the homeowner, admiring the splash of color and the life it brought to the block. Karen, however, grew more desperate. One morning, the homeowner spotted her pacing on the sidewalk, loudly talking on the phone, her voice dripping with outrage. She was calling the county inspector, demanding immediate action. A week later, a county vehicle pulled up in front of the house, and an officer stepped out with a clipboard. Karen followed behind him, smug and confident, certain this was the moment the jungle would fall. But what Karen hadn't realized was that the homeowner had already filed their paperwork for certification. The inspection scheduled that day wasn't at Karen's request, it was part of the homeowner's plan. The officer wasn't there to shut the yard down. He was there to assess whether it qualified as a protected wildlife habitat. Karen's smile faltered when she realized what was happening. The officer walked the property, noting the variety of native plants, the birdhouses, the pollinator-friendly flowers, and the carefully placed water source. Every requirement on the checklist was present. Karen tried to interject, pointing out what she called weeds and overgrowth, but the officer brushed her aside. He wasn't there to judge aesthetics, he was there to determine compliance with state wildlife standards. By the time he left, Karen's confidence had evaporated. The homeowner didn't celebrate openly, but inside, hope surged. The jungle wasn't just a rebellion anymore. It was on the verge of becoming untouchable. The certification letter was coming. And when it arrived, the HOA's power would crumble. But Karen wasn't finished. If anything, the setback only fueled her obsession. She was about to take the fight to an entirely new level, one that would test the homeowner's resolve like never before. Chapter 4, the HOA's Last Stand. Karen was seething. The inspection had not gone the way she expected, and worse, it had shown her weakness. For years she had built her reputation in the neighborhood as the enforcer, the one who kept lawns clipped, hedges trimmed, and houses painted in acceptable shades of beige. But now, her power was slipping. A single homeowner had defied her, and instead of backing down, they were edging closer to an ironclad legal shield. She refused to let that happen. At the next HOA board meeting, Karen arrived armed with binders, photographs, and a speech dripping with indignation. She painted the homeowner's yard as a health hazard, a threat to community values, and even suggested it could attract pests and lower home prices. She pounded her fist on the table, insisting that if the HOA didn't act decisively, their entire authority would unravel. Some board members hesitated, weary of Karen's intensity, but others feared the precedent. If one resident could break the rules, what was to stop others from following suit? After hours of debate, the board sided with Karen. A formal vote passed, the HOA would pursue legal action. The homeowner received the notice days later. It was harsher than any previous letter. The HOA demanded immediate compliance, the removal of all non-standard vegetation, and payment of accumulated fines. If not, they threatened to file a lawsuit. For a moment, the homeowner felt the weight of exhaustion. The yard had grown into something beautiful, but was it worth the stress, the late nights, the constant harassment? Yet as they walked outside, the sight of butterflies fluttering among blossoms and birdsong filling the air renewed their determination. The yard wasn't just theirs anymore, it belonged to every creature that had found refuge there. It was a living defense against uniformity, and it was worth fighting for. So the homeowner doubled down. They contacted an environmental attorney, who confirmed what they already suspected: the HOA's case was weak. State law recognized certified wildlife habitats as protected entities, and once certification was complete, the HOA could not force removal. The attorney encouraged them to stay the course, keep records, and let the process finish. Meanwhile, the yard grew wilder, fuller, and more alive. The once modest patch of green now resembled a miniature woodland. Birds nested in the shrubs, bees filled the air with a steady hum, and the scent of wildflowers drifted across the property. Children from nearby houses began to wander over, curious about the secret garden. Parents whispered admiration, though few dared to voice it publicly. Karen, however, grew more unhinged. She left angry notes taped to the homeowner's door. She stood in the street, shaking her head theatrically whenever she passed. One afternoon, she even marched up the driveway with clippers in hand, only to be stopped when the homeowner's security cameras captured her trespassing. The footage was turned over to local authorities, and while Karen received only a warning, it was a public embarrassment. Yet even humiliation didn't stop her. She pressed the HOA harder, demanding they accelerate their lawsuit. The board complied, filing paperwork in small claims court. But just as Karen was preparing her victory speech, the homeowner received the envelope they had been waiting for, the official certification of their property as a recognized wildlife habitat. It was the shield they needed. And soon, it would become the sword. The battle was no longer about 1 yard. It was about freedom, law, and the downfall of an overreaching HOA. Chapter 5, The Certification Reveal. The envelope was plain, but its contents carried the weight of victory. Inside was a crisp certificate bordered in green, stamped with the seal of the state's Department of Conservation. It officially recognized the property as a certified wildlife habitat. Every flower, every bush, every birdhouse, and water source had passed inspection. What Karen and the HOA had labeled as messy and non-compliant was now legally protected by state law. The homeowner carefully framed the certificate and hung it inside the entryway. But simply having it wasn't enough, this document needed to be wielded. The very next morning, the HOA's lawyer filed their lawsuit, demanding immediate compliance and the removal of all unauthorized landscaping. The homeowner responded with a single, powerful motion, a legal dismissal, backed by the certification. Their attorney submitted photos, receipts, inspection records, and the state's own documentation proving the yard was protected. Karen didn't know yet. She was busy circulating flyers around the neighborhood, urging residents to stand against the jungle. She walked door to door, gathering signatures for a petition to have the homeowner fined and forced into compliance. To her, victory was inevitable, the lawsuit a final nail in the coffin. Then came the hearing. On the morning of the court date, the homeowner arrived with their attorney, carrying a neat binder of evidence. Karen was already there, pacing outside the courtroom, clutching her binder of photos. She was all but glowing, convinced that the HOA's authority would be upheld. She even smirked when she saw the homeowner walk in. But the smirk didn't last. When the judge reviewed the homeowner's documentation, the mood shifted immediately. The certificate alone was enough to raise serious doubts about the HOA's case. The law was clear: certified habitats were exempt from HOA landscaping restrictions. The more Karen tried to argue, the more impatient the judge became. Her complaints about unsightliness and property values had no standing against state law. The judge ruled in favor of the homeowner, dismissing the case entirely. Not only that, but the HOA was warned that any further attempts to fine or harass the homeowner over their yard could be considered harassment and subject to legal penalties. Karen sat frozen, her binder of photos useless, her years of intimidation crumbling in front of her. The other board members shifted uncomfortably, realizing the HOA's authority had been dealt a blow it might never recover from. When the homeowner walked out of the courthouse, the weight of months of stress seemed to lift. They didn't celebrate loudly or mock their enemies. They simply smiled, knowing the jungle in their yard was now permanent, protected, and undeniable. News spread quickly through the neighborhood. Some residents approached quietly to congratulate the homeowner. Others, tired of Karen's tyranny, began openly questioning why the HOA had wasted money pursuing such a case. Whispers of change floated through the community. The power balance was shifting. Karen, however, was not done sulking. Her pride had been shattered, but her bitterness lingered. She avoided the homeowner's gaze whenever she passed the house, her once booming voice now reduced to mutters. But the homeowner no longer cared. Their yard stood tall, alive with color and sound. And soon, it would be more than a personal victory, it would become a symbol for others, both in the neighborhood and beyond. Because the homeowner had one more surprise planned, a final act that would cement their jungle as more than just a yard, it would become a legacy. Chapter 6, The Jungle Triumphs. The weeks after the courtroom victory felt like a new season in the neighborhood. The homeowner walked through their yard with a different sense of pride now, not just in the riot of colors and life, but in the knowledge that every flower, every blade of grass, and every bird nesting in the shrubs was backed by law. The HOA could no longer touch it. Their endless threats and fines had been rendered meaningless. But the homeowner wasn't content with quiet victory. They had endured months of harassment, intimidation, and stress. And now, they wanted to ensure no one else would ever have to fight the same battle. The first step was simple: they contacted the local newspaper. A journalist, intrigued by the clash between a stubborn HOA and an environmentally conscious homeowner, came out to see the property. The yard was alive with pollinators, blossoms, and birdsong. The reporter snapped photos, interviewed the homeowner, and published a feature that painted the HOA as petty and outdated. The article spread quickly, picked up by regional outlets, and before long, the story made its way onto social media feeds across the country. Suddenly, the jungle was famous. People applauded the homeowner's determination, calling them an inspiration. Environmental groups praised the use of native plants. Other homeowners, tired of strict HOA rules, began asking how they too could certify their yards as wildlife habitats. The homeowner answered emails, gave interviews, and even spoke at a local environmental event. What had begun as an HOA dispute had blossomed into a small movement. Meanwhile, the HOA board faced growing unrest. Neighbors began questioning why so much time and money had been wasted on Karen's crusade. At the next board meeting, tensions erupted. Several residents demanded Karen's resignation, accusing her of abusing her position and dragging the community into unnecessary conflict. Karen tried to defend herself, insisting she had acted for the good of the neighborhood. But her words rang hollow. The votes were cast, and Karen was removed from the board. Her reign of strict rules and petty complaints was over. The homeowner didn't celebrate Karen's downfall openly. They didn't need to. The jungle in their yard stood as the clearest victory of all. The HOA no longer dared to send threatening letters, and neighbors who once frowned now lingered on the sidewalk, admiring the wildflowers and snapping photos of the butterflies. In time, something remarkable happened: the jungle inspired change. Other residents began planting more native flowers, swapping out sterile lawns for vibrant gardens. Slowly, the neighborhood shifted, trading conformity for color, lifeless grass for thriving ecosystems. The homeowner's defiance had sparked a quiet revolution. On a warm evening months later, the homeowner stood at the edge of their yard, listening to the hum of bees and the chirp of crickets. The once uniform street now looked alive, each home carrying hints of individuality, each yard whispering rebellion against rigid rules. The battle had been long, and at times overwhelming, but it had ended not just in victory, but in transformation. The HOA had tried to control the yard. But instead, the yard had changed the neighborhood forever. And in the middle of it all, the jungle thrived.